I'd like to go through the stages of development and kind of go through each one. Mm-hmm. I think it'd be great to have that and to kind of explore again, because I think a lot of our readers are familiar with these things, but some aren't. And some of other people who probably listen to it, they haven't, it always helps to have these sort of, re-explained.
These stages have been used and described by so many different names, and within the integral movement, a shorthand way of describing them has come to be in the form of colors. The spiral dynamics colors, and now Ken Wilber has, a variant of that, which uses some of the same colors and some different colors to describe the stages. And again, the motivation for the color terminology was certainly good. They wanted it arose within the context of working with South Africans, and colors there are a significant flashpoint. So all that's been good, and it's a great shorthand. It's much easier to say green or blue than it is to use some other more clunky philosophical terms.
That's true. But you don't use the colors.
I use the terms. What I try to just sort of glean the terms that are being used, right? Like, so for example, Paul Ray in his sociological research refers to the traditionals, the moderns, and then he calls them the cultural creatives, which is sort of this kind of cutesy term for the green worldview. And
at this point you have 8 levels you refer to in the book, and you start out the beginning with archaic.
Right, and that would correspond to the spiral dynamic color known as beige, which is sort of pre-tribal, survival clan, Neanderthal consciousness, however you want to put it. And I don't spend a lot of time on that because certainly there's not a lot of research about that.
Right.
I guess we could sort of point to Stan Grof and some of his stuff about natal consciousness and neonatal consciousness. And nevertheless, archaic, at least according to Graves' research, is found today only in people in infants and in people who've regressed through illness or injury. So I don't spend a lot of time on that. Okay. But the first sort of cultural worldview that pretty much every developmental psychologist agrees about and that's been studied and really well defined is tribal consciousness. This is described in spiral dynamics colors as the purple meme.
Okay.
And tribal consciousness is a form of consciousness which is remarkably similar all over the world. Like somebody, I was giving a talk about integral philosophy, and somebody said, how do we know that what's next for the traditional consciousness of Islam is modernism, And how do we know that they're not going to just go their own way? And, that was an insightful and important question. And I thought, well, I think, inevitably part of it will be original. It must be original, but part of it will also be similar. And one of the reasons that we know this is that we look at all the different varieties of tribal consciousness, and they're all different, and they're all unique, and they're all special, and they're all wonderful and in their own way. And yet, they're all remarkably similar in the sense that they're animistic, in the sense that they have the gods and the chief and the, and the status of women.
Just to be clear, you're talking about, when you say they're all, you're talking about, these are indigenous, we see this mostly in indigenous cultures?
Clans and tribes, right? So, for example, you can see, people, the groups of people living in the Amazon rainforest.
Yes.
Okay, they have a tribal structure of organization. They have a chief. They have many gods. The gods are sort of seen as living within nature. Their worldview, their social structure, the degree of their language. As anthropologists have studied these, I hate to use the word primitive, but you know what I mean, without being pejorative.
Yeah.
These people who are certainly not living in the modern world, who were living in a time in history when, at one time that was the cutting edge of development for social evolution within humanity.
Right.
People were either at a version of a clan or a tribe, and for thousands of years that was the social structure of humanity.
When would you think, just to be more specific, did this consciousness arise? Like, what time period are we talking about? Obviously there's examples of it today. But
I think anything in prehistory is certainly subject. It becomes like a Rorschach test for your belief system.
That's true.
Nevertheless, I think 40,000 years ago is probably a good guess.
Okay, good. And would you say this tribal consciousness, or this purple meme, or this was when for example, we spoke about Teilhard earlier. He talks about the birth of the noosphere, the birth of thought. Was that initial kind of burst into this first levels of consciousness, when the noosphere first came into being? Would you say that was the initiation of this
Well, that's a really good question.
Tribal consciousness?
I'm not sure. I don't want to pretend like I'm the expert on everything here, and I think there's one argument that says, that the biology of humans, more or less, is 1 million years old.
Mm-hmm.
Like they can trace, even though they're not Homo sapiens, but there's some anthropologists or paleontologists date the appearance of humanity to about 1 million years BC.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one argument that's the birth of thought, as Teilhard calls it. I'm not sure. I certainly wasn't around.
Although there's a lot of evidence that the genetic systems have been changing pretty regularly since then. And
however, the structure of the brain certainly hasn't changed much in the last 10,000 years.
Right. Okay. Cool. So the last many thousands of years, at least back.
Yeah, let's date it to 40,000 years, and I think it is important because the emergence of human culture. What is archaic culture? We don't have evidence really of it. We don't know whether it constitutes the kind of culture that allows human consciousness to evolve beyond its biological roots. That's one of my points in the book is that it's this artificial complexity of culture brought about through language, through tools, through social organizations. That allow complexity to extend beyond biology in ways that animals can't do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So humanity extends its consciousness through the extension of this culture, which stands in for the lack of biological development and allows consciousness to grow beyond its biological roots and enter into this whole new pace. The noosphere has proved that it's a new phase of evolution because the speed at which the evolution is occurring, just like the biosphere evolves much faster than the physiosphere, the noosphere evolves much faster than the biosphere, and that's because, in the last 40,000 years, human culture has transformed the world. And we can now see how how consciousness can evolve, even though the biology is not evolving. Because before human culture, biology and consciousness had to evolve in lockstep together. For an animal to get smarter, it had to evolve its biology.
Right.
It could learn a few things,
which is a slower process, right?
Way slower, right? And so we replace natural selection with actual selection, and human culture begins to emerge first, slowly. There's certainly a geometrical progression where the line gets steeper as it occurs. And we see tribal organization as one of the first forms of recognizable culture that is able to extend consciousness beyond its biological roots. So back there in the dim depths of history, we can't really be sure, about when these things developed but
this is in some sense a pre-agriculture, early agriculture, but not when we think of the agricultural revolution sort of 10,000 years ago. People talk about this is sort of pre that.
Hunting and gathering is definitely the economic mode of subsistence, and we can see that in the Amazon tribes, right?
And when people talk about when Reen Eisler, certain people talk about. Because we've been doing some research on that. A lot of people talk about this early stage of history when they were matriarchal and they were kind of peaceful and they often are, I think, they're often referring to this kind of meme or this kind of consciousness. Now, we tend to kind of see this kind of consciousness through the lens of our own worldview.
That's why I say, especially with, Eisler.
We can sometimes project all kinds of things on it that weren't actually true. But that's often what we're, But I think when we talk about this prehistory, early history, we're talking about this level of consciousness.
Indeed.
And just to be clear, it's fascinating to us and continues to be fascinating that it's such a revolutionary way of understanding the development of human consciousness, because we tend to think people 40,000 years ago were essentially just like us, or 10,000 years ago were essentially just like us with less technology. That's how a lot of historians tend to think about the human condition. Basically people in ancient Greece were just like us now. It was just a different environmental, economic, social condition.
Right.
But when you start to actually look at this through the lens of what you're calling an integral worldview and begin to see that consciousness itself, meaning the own nature of what we're aware of and the capacity of our own consciousness, our own brain to perceive the world around us and the way in which we understand and think about the world around us has developed so profoundly over the last 40,000 years. The way people are actually perceiving and the nature of their own consciousness, in this early level, and what we were calling more primitive level, was just very, very different. It's hard to actually probably relate to how it was.
Well, but one of the, there's we go back to developmental psychology, and we see that these people have actually done quite a bit of research, hard scientific research published in peer-reviewed journals that actually shows that if you go and you interview people living in tribal circumstances and you are able to learn their language and talk to them in their own terms, the overwhelming research shows that they don't think in syllogisms. They don't use logic. They have, a word only corresponds to an individual thing. They can't think in categories. That's disturbing research for a lot of people because it seems, socially Darwinistic or something, and of course, we definitely eschew that. But the research is there, and of course, few of us know people living in tribal consciousness, so we just sort of project what they must be just like us, but they're closer to nature or whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But again, there's quite a bit of empirical research. It's hard to ignore that the tribal consciousness, even though their sense of smell is more well developed than ours, and their ability to recognize animal tracks, they certainly have skills that we don't.
Yes,
but
they are closer to nature in that sense, probably, but not self-consciously closer to nature.
No, and one of the things, there are certain markers that are objective in terms of looking at cultural evolution. Mm-hmm. One is the status of women, right? The more equal women are in a given social circumstance, the more evolved that circumstance is. Another one is the presence of fear, right? The less the mind is dominated by fear, the higher the level of consciousness. The diminution of fear is one of the markers of advancing, developing, evolving consciousness. Right. And, of course, one of the things that you see that is a characteristic of tribal peoples is that fear is huge. Is that superstition, the barrier against fear is sort of the frame of their entire worldview. And here we can see that, okay, what's beyond tribal consciousness? Again, there's some confusion here, but this is where this system of spiral dynamics is so useful in distinguishing and recognizing that the evolution of culture and consciousness is not a seamless continuum where there's sort of just an accumulation over time and a kind of a line of development that's sort of unidirectional. Mm-hmm. In fact, the way these worldviews emerge is through a dialectic of development. Hegel saw it all clearly from the beginning. That is, there's a tension, and it's that is the very nature of a conflicting situation provides the energy that fuels the growth. And so, change and growth and social progress emerges out of conflict. And so the limitations of the tribal worldview define the opportunities for what comes next. Mm-hmm. And what comes next moves from a more communitarian orientation to a more individualistic orientation, and we get a cultural form which spiral dynamics identifies as the red meme. And this is the only one I've sort of tried to coin a term for. I don't know whether anybody else has used the term warrior consciousness, but I use the term warrior consciousness, and it's rather, I don't see it in any other literature, but I've tried to choose a name that was descriptive. Like all these names are sort of non-judgmental. They're not, like naive consciousness is a name that's used for tribal. Well, that's kind of condescending. I think tribal should be recognized as having an essential dignity, not all fear and superstition. Right. A lot of it is, there's part of it, family loyalty. There are enduring values for each one of these worldviews that unless they're included within higher structures, development becomes arrested.
What were the life conditions? What caused warrior consciousness to develop out of the original tribal consciousness?
Well, I think part of it had to do with the success. Again, recognizing this as a dynamic system, the whole spiral, the whole stage. The stages themselves are not just systems, but they're within a system. Mm-hmm. Recognizing that a sustainable emergence of a new phase, a historically significant new phase of culture, can only really occur when the stage before it has become successful. And again, I want to use sort of philosophical terms to describe this. Not only is the relationship between the stages in a dialectic, where any given stage is a thesis, and then the next stage to emerge beyond it initially occurs in somewhat of an antithesis to the thesis of the first stage. Mm-hmm. Not only do we see the stages in a dialectical relationship themselves, we can see the dialectic emerging within the progress of each stage. So, for example, each stage begins as an antithesis to what came before. And then once it kind of distinguishes itself and differentiates itself from the previous stage, it then goes through a season of synthesis where its work is done, where it achieves what it's really designed to achieve, and it kind of subdues the life conditions that gave it life. Mm. But then as these conditions are satisfied, as the progress is made and the synthesis is relatively achieved, then as those problems are no longer as pressing, that the vitality of that stage becomes lost, because the problems are what gives it its vitality, and as it solves the problems, it loses energy. And then it sort of moves from a synthesis into a more of a stale thesis of itself. And that sort of signals its success. It's when the synthesis becomes exhausted and sort of matures into a thesis that it then emerges within it the problems that can bring forth the next antithesis. And this is the systemic motion of evolution at every level. Okay. So we see tribal consciousness becoming successful, right? The people have enough food. The pantheon of gods are developed so that fear is kind of kept in check. That there's a social order and a hierarchy. And it's extremely stable. I mean, tribal consciousness can go on for tens of thousands of years without much change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But in the forms of tribal consciousness that are the most successful, both socially and culturally, the synthesis becomes a thesis, and there becomes specific problems, like the fact that the youth of the tribe are stuck within a hierarchy. They can't express themselves. Mm-hmm. They're sort of subordinate to the chief, from birth to death. And there's a restlessness. There's a yearning for more. There's a yearning for status, a yearning for power, a yearning for glory, a yearning for achievement. And this is, again, the expression of the individual in contrast with the communal. Mm-hmm. And so warrior consciousness it's sort of a fiery ordeal through which civilization must pass as it breaks out of the kind of biological inertia of tribal consciousness and moves into the next emergent stage, which, again, as we see within this dialectical system, it moves from a communitarian orientation where the idea is to sacrifice the self for the sake of the group, which we see in tribal consciousness, into a culture which is, more about the expression of the self, even at the sake of the group. And here we see warrior consciousness. Mm-hmm. And we see this manifestation of individuality in warrior consciousness in many different ways. Even, for example, if we look at history, you can see that the ancient Germans, when they fought the Romans, they fought as individuals. They weren't coordinated. Each fighter was an individual guy who they weren't coordinated. Whereas the Romans, who had traditional consciousness and beyond, they fought as a unit, and it wasn't just individuals in the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And it was indeed that very form of organization that allowed them to defeat the Germans, who were physically bigger and stronger. Mm-hmm.
Also, it seems like there's environmental pressures here that must be influencing this, and technological pressures. They're all kind of working together. Would you say that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, again, the life conditions are physical. They're historical. They're observable. They're economic. They're political. Right. And so economic, political conditions. This evolution isn't just occurring in the noosphere and in this sort of the internal universe. Indeed, the internal universe is very intertwined and completely interconnected with the external circumstances of the human condition.
So what time period are we talking about in the emergence of warrior consciousness?
Well, again, this is something that deserves further study. I think Gebser dates it to a certain date. Developmental psychologists can bicker about it. But, I think that, probably, somewhere between 10,000 and 5,000 BC. Mm-hmm. But again, that's kind of a glib answer because the prehistory has been so abused, and used as a sort of a medium for myth making that I've sort of been, not very attracted to it.
Yes. And when in individual development do we see warrior consciousness?
Well, I think we see it definitely in another word for it in developmental psychology is egocentric consciousness. Mm-hmm. So again, these things are especially in the youth of the developed world, we see these stages of consciousness emerging more in chords. So maybe you can first see egocentric consciousness in the terrible twos, right? Mm-hmm. But again, you don't see it fully emerging until, I'd say, 8 years old, 7 years old. Depends on the family. It depends on the kid. Egocentric consciousness is certainly, we can see it in adolescence, we can see it in youth, and obviously we can see it in some adults.
Yeah, certainly. Teenage rebellion, that sort of thing in a way.
Yeah. But again, one of the things I really want to stress, especially at these lower levels of tribal and warrior, is that there's a nobility and a beauty which we must preserve and carry forward. We can't just suppress them. We can't just vilify them. We can't just see them for their pathologies. We have to compassionately recognize that there's part of this fierce individuality and individual autonomy and personal, agency that is an absolutely necessary part of a developed form of consciousness at these higher stages. Unless you've embraced warrior, not only in your own consciousness, but in the social structures of your society, then you're going to be arrested at some level of development because that part of the system's not functioning. Just like your brain doesn't function if your limbic system goes out, right? Your society doesn't function if there's not healthy forms of warrior consciousness in place to protect the rights of individuals.
Right. So there's a healthy version of each of these worldviews, and there's an unhealthy version of each of these worldviews. And unfortunately, it seems like we see a lot of very unhealthy versions of warrior consciousness right now in the world.
And that's why it's important to kind of to also keep in. I mean, we can see warrior consciousness in urban street gangs. We can see warrior consciousness in places like Somalia, right? We see wherever there's fighting and war and violence and a complete lack of morality, there you'll find warrior consciousness. But at the same time, historically, I like to identify two types of warrior societies that have been romanticized. And even though they've been overly romanticized, they nevertheless provide a good example for us culturally of the nobility of the warrior consciousness.
Okay.
And two of those societies are the Lakota Sioux Indians and the ancient Hawaiians. Okay? Now, people would say, well, they were advanced beyond warrior. And I would say, well, no, look at the social circumstances. They didn't have writing. Writing is a huge thing that distinguishes warrior consciousness from traditional consciousness. Okay. They were indeed fierce warriors, and indeed their social structure was based on, fighting ability. And they were, the status of women. I mean, women and men couldn't eat in the same building in Hawaiian society. And so we see all kinds of things which are glossed over in the romantic portrayals of these cultures. But I think it's useful to have romantic portrayals of warrior culture and to sort of, Thomas Berry writes about the sort of the essential nobility of the pre-traditional, man, and he really resonates with it. And again, a lot of the romantics and environmentalists have projected, their utopian ideals upon a warrior level because there's so much about traditional that they're sort of repulsed by.
In a not dissimilar way to the way in which many people in the 60s sort of projected this romantic idea onto Hell's Angels or bikers or that sort of thing. I mean, there's a similarity there, right, in the way that a lot of people did.
Sure. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before, but yeah, absolutely. And so there, again, we see these harmonics. Right? Green resonates. It has a harmonic resonance with red. That is, postmodern consciousness has an affinity with warrior consciousness. And, it's kind of weird, but nevertheless, you can see it in many cultural expressions of postmodernism, having a romantic affinity for these expressions of warrior culture. Understanding warrior consciousness is very important to understanding traditional, which is on the scene and something we have to deal with. But warrior consciousness is only sort of, it's not one of the world's worst problems at this point. It's more pathological forms of traditional and modernist consciousness, right. And the impetucy of postmodern consciousness that's creating our current dilemma. So, traditional consciousness. The traditional consciousness is a significant step beyond warrior consciousness because with traditional consciousness we move from a more or less egocentric or at the best family-centric kind of consciousness where those worthy of moral consideration are just yourself and the members of your blood kin. We move from that to an ethnocentric estimate of morality where people worthy of moral consideration include not just your blood kin, but those who share the same mythic belief structure as you do, or the same nationality, or the same, whatever the organizing principle of the traditional consciousness frame is. The people who are within that frame become subject to the golden rule, if you will. I mean, the golden rule as a principle or a mores can be found in every form of traditional culture. It's universal, but it's hard to find prior to the emergence of traditional consciousness. In our popular Western culture, of course, traditional people whose center of gravity is within traditional consciousness are the whipping boys of the media. Everybody loves to hate the fundamentalists, right? They're the cause of all the world's problems. Right. But in the course of history, ethnocentrism is a significant step beyond egocentrism as a operating principle.
So a tribal person who is maybe in a very magical relationship to spirituality and religion, and is, as you say, very connected to their kin and their blood kin, and the relationships are all defined by that, who converts, let's say, to Christianity for one reason or another, or converts to Islam or something of that sort, would be, in some sense, that's almost representative of that sort of transition, I think, is what you're saying.
Right, and what it does is it allows for larger civilizations. You know, the civilization of tribal and warrior consciousness can't grow much beyond an extended blood kin, tribe.
Right.
Whereas when you move to traditional consciousness, all of a sudden you can have civilizations that consist of thousands and thousands of people, and they'll all be willing to be civil to each other because they're all held within the same worldview.
Right, exactly. And in some ways we obviously look askance in some ways at ethnocentric consciousness because for all of its problems, if it tends to be overly nationalistic, or if religions tend to be only focused on on the salvation of their particular tribe or their particular religious orientation.
Ethnocentrism is kind of a scaffolding of history, right? Once the building is constructed, we can remove it.
But you can see, though, at a certain point how important it might have been. I'd like to use the example of slavery. A lot of slaves converted to Christianity, apparently in the American South at one point, because they were on the level of on that level they could be respected almost as equals, or at least much more respected on that level as Christians, as fellow brothers and Christians or sisters and Christians, than they were in their tribal identities.
Well, certainly there were extrinsic motivations to become sort of more equal parts of American society, but also I think we can recognize intrinsic motivations inherent in spiritual teachings of Christianity or other, the sort of the core of all the great traditional forms of consciousness involve high spiritual truths that are attractive unto themselves.
And traditional consciousness, would you say, in some sense, was responsible for the rise of many of the world's great religions?
Well, I think traditional consciousness is more or less synonymous with the world's great religions.
Right.
And although the consciousness of the founders of the world great religions was certainly at a stage well beyond traditional consciousness, the form that came to contain these world religions and made them into civilizations was definitely, unmistakably a traditional form of consciousness.
Okay.
Alternative names for this stage include conformist consciousness, conventional consciousness, and of course the blue meme in the spiral dynamic system. Mm-hmm. But each one of these stages, when it emerges, it brings a new epistemological capacity. These aren't just new ways of seeing things. They actually, what makes these stages, what adds to their empirical quality, is that we can see that as someone's consciousness is transformed to a higher stage, and you can see this in history too. You don't have to do an EEG, you don't have to measure their brain waves, but indeed new parts of the brain become wired up as these stages of consciousness are ascended. Mm-hmm. And with this new capacity comes a new epistemological capacity, a new power that gives each historically significant stage, a significant advantage over the stages that came before it. In other words, each one of the stages, as they emerge, has a leg up on the stages before by the nature of what it brings, by its new powers and new capacities.
And how would you define what's the essence of this new epistemological capacity that emerges with traditional consciousness?
Well, one way to see it is as the emergence of a new perspective. So, for example, within tribal consciousness, and again, I don't want to overstate this, but this is just understand what I'm saying loosely. Often consciousness is limited to a sort of a first-person perspective, and we can see this in that tribal consciousness often has a difficult time distinguishing between subjects and objects, right? That is, rocks and trees are endowed with subjectivity as though they're, alive, and sometimes, people are just seen as objects themselves. But with the emergence of traditional consciousness, we move from a first-person perspective to a second-person perspective, and this was what brings this golden rule. In other words, the other person can be respected more and recognized more, and this does definitely bring a new power.
Mm-hmm.
And it also brings a new organizational ability. Because of the solidarity with greater amounts of people, there's a much higher level of organization possible, and cooperation and group discipline. And so, for example, even though sometimes those with warrior consciousness are more brave and more fearless, in history, civilizations that have achieved a traditional stage of consciousness are almost always able to defeat the warrior stage cultures because of their superior group discipline and cohesion as or an organized military structure.
Very interesting. Is there also an element of one's relationship, because I think of traditional consciousness as being a whole new stage also in terms of the relationship to the interior of the self. People talk about the birth of the religious times, the axial age, which some people consider to be the birth of this traditional worldview, as this time when there was a new relationship to the interior dimension of the self.
I don't think there's any question about that. I think the self becomes larger with each stage.
That's it. Yeah. Exactly.
And
just to be clear, that the one's own sense of, for lack of a better word, space, or the dimensions of one's own interior world become larger and more expanded, and
right. Well, when your consciousness is raised, I mean, it's a metaphor to speak of location and space, using spatial metaphors to describe something non-local like consciousness. But nevertheless, the spaciousness of consciousness expands as consciousness is raised, and this spiral does definitely chart the way that consciousness is raised. We can see stages of history. We can acknowledge that there's multiple lines of development, different currents, subsets, and again, this is not one of the important elements of using the spiral as a method, is to understand a level of subtlety in using it that avoids stereotyping, pigeonholing, or seeing these stages as sort of absolutistic blueprints for how things must emerge. So it's worth saying that, but let's cover the basics here, because you and I are both so familiar with this that I think at least I have a tendency to sort of neglect sort of saying, well, what is it about, what are the values of traditional consciousness, right? There's all kinds of values of traditional consciousness, but as we see it today, we can number among its more positive values a value of order, law and order, piety and reverence for their belief system, decency and honesty, and respect for traditions and conservative mores. And traditional consciousness is healthy forms of traditional consciousness in the history of a culture are absolutely necessary for higher stages to be sustainable and maintainable. And a good way to illustrate this is to use the analogy of the fall of communism in Russia. Up until the communist revolution, the Marxist revolution, we have the Russian Orthodox Church providing a kind of a weak form of traditional consciousness in Russia. In other words, it was nowhere near as strong as the Christianity of Western Europe, because it wasn't as evolutionarily, the society was still feudal at the turn of the 20th century. And so, nevertheless, we have Marxism come in, and it basically it sweeps away the traditional structures of Orthodox Christianity and replaces it with what comes to be an alternative form of conformist consciousness, that is the Soviet state.
Right.
And then for 70 years...
Which is also traditional form. It's not...
Right. You conform to this higher authority, and you're conventional. And it replaces religion, and it serves the same function to cohere the society. Okay. But, of course, it's even less successful as an evolutionary platform for higher development than Orthodox Christianity. But nevertheless, we see communism then in 1990... it's swept away, and the Soviet state collapses, and we have the breakup of modern Russia. And at the time, Western investors assumed that the Soviet economy would be ripe for development. That just like Japan after World War II or Germany, that the Soviets, the Russian people would be poised for significant economic growth once they had been freed from the fetters of communism. However, because so much of this traditional structure had ceased to exist, the transcendent purpose of the world workers' revolution, had gone away, and so the structures of traditional consciousness more or less collapsed in Russia, and the Orthodox Church was too weak to kind of, sort of take the place immediately of those defunct traditional structures. So what happened was that a big portion of the society was left at the warrior stage of consciousness without any kind of traditional consciousness in place to keep people from being egocentric, to keep sort of good citizenship and a sort of sense of duty to the society. Those things were gone. So all the investment that went in 1990 only exacerbated the rise of horrendous levels of organized crime, which we still see as being a major plague of that keeps Russia from developing at the same pace of other European societies.
It was slowly descending into that kind of warrior level, or you could feel the society. Was it because that scaffolding of that structure, traditional consciousness, had given way?
Right. And so traditional consciousness is necessary because the difference, again, looking at the dialectic of the spiral, we see warrior consciousness, and then traditional consciousness emerges, and then modernist consciousness appears beyond. And modernist consciousness, the only difference between modernist consciousness and warrior consciousness, and from some points of view, is that modernist consciousness transcends and includes the good citizenship and duty to the society and sort of sense of fair play that comes from traditional consciousness. And if traditional consciousness isn't there intervening to keep the modernists from, keeping them playing by the rules, then they become you start to see more and more egocentric warrior-like behaviors.
Do you think Putin, in that sense, is being a good thing for Russia?
Well, I think that
whatever we may think about him personally.
I think that we can certainly be, from an integral perspective, recognizing that functional democracies can't form until there's a stable base of traditional consciousness within a culture. That like you see in Iraq, the democracy is a farce. Yeah. And that's because there's not the traditional consciousness isn't ready to support democracy. And so, to the extent that Putin has sort of regressed from kind of an ostensible democracy to increasingly a more authoritarian state of government, while in some ways any kind of regression can be, regretted and decried, I still think that we can be a little more sympathetic in understanding that this is a necessary step for them to consolidate before they can truly grow beyond. Makes sense. We can also see how, as of 1950, the only countries that had developed modernism, except for Japan, were countries that were sort of within the Christian, Judeo-Christian, mostly Protestant background. And that's because that's the most, just from a historical integral perspective, that's the platform that produced modernism, first and more abundantly than any other platform. But when we look at Japan and say, well, how come Japan developed their own native form of modernism, and how come modernism is so successful in Japan? Again, it goes back to understanding traditional culture. Because there's nothing specific about Christianity. I mean, well, we could argue about that, but there's nothing specific about it that is, Christianity is certainly not required for modernist consciousness, because we can see it successfully in Japan for at least the last 130 years. And that's because the Buddhist Shinto culture of Japan was so successful and so refined, and part of its success came from 200 years of self-imposed isolation, where it didn't suffer the ravages of colonialism, and because their traditional culture was so strong, and their sense of allegiance to being Japanese, and the fact that they were an island, all these things contributed to that sense of duty that was and good citizenship that was a necessary prerequisite to successful modernism. And that's why Japan's a very important lesson. Now we can see Confucianism also serving as a good basis, where we look at the Asian tigers like Taiwan and South Korea. The good citizenship of traditional consciousness there comes from Confucian values. And that forms the basis of good citizenship that's required for modernism to be successful. I mean, modernism's not successful in many countries because of corruption. Right? It becomes a kleptocracy. Nothing can, that business can't really go anywhere because nobody can really invest because you can't trust.
That's like pouring money into certain countries, developing countries. You don't get anywhere with it.
Just like pouring water into sand.
Exactly.
There's just there's no catch basin for it.
Right.
Anyway.
Fascinating. Very interesting.
Yeah. So we could spend an hour talking about traditional consciousness, but I think that what can help people who are in postmodern and modernist consciousness come to better appreciate the people who live in this earlier time in history, even in our time, is that we see that these are that that there's an ongoing contribution that this stage provides. And obviously we want to transcend ethnocentrism. We want to transcend fundamentalism. And it's certainly not every traditional form of consciousness is a fundamentalism is a form of traditional consciousness orthodoxy, right? Every stage of consciousness, as it's threatened, as it ages, develops a form of orthodoxy. You can see orthodoxy not only in traditional consciousness, you can see it in modernist consciousness, and it's beginning to appear in postmodern consciousness, too. That's one of the markers of the maturity of postmodern consciousness.
So
it's developing its own pathologies.
What would be the orthodoxy of modernism? Like Richard Dawkins, are we talking about?
Yeah, well, extreme materialism, atheism, the denial of all internal reality, and the denial of all spiritual reality, that's a form of modernist orthodoxy, definitely.
Okay, and so postmodern, what would be postmodern?
Postmodern orthodoxy is seen in the strict political correctness that we see dominating the educational and entertainment establishments. Not that it's a bad thing. Again, the postmodernism is still fairly young. Its orthodoxies are not as rigid, but you can see how that as, in this century, political correctness and its problems are, going to be something we have to deal with, although it's certainly not the worst of the world's problems.
Right. In terms of, we've been talking about traditional consciousness. Before we move on, we've already moved on a little bit, but this transition from warrior consciousness to traditional consciousness, what in the spiral terms or in Claire Graves' system or Don Beck's system would be called red to blue. I think Ken calls the stage amber now. This is a big issue in the world right now, this transition from warrior to traditional consciousness. And obviously, when you talk about fundamentalism, Islam is a big subject that immediately comes up. So how do you see the dynamics, just before we move on, of Islam right now dealing with this transition or dealing with this issues of modernism versus traditional versus warrior, which are all big part of the dynamics that are playing out there?
Yeah, part of the way to understand this cultural growth is, again, understanding that it's a living system and that the system is this dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And part of what generates the motion of the system is the separation. If you have a stillborn antithesis, if you don't move far enough away from the thesis, then you don't have the inherent conflict necessary to generate the energy that causes the progress. And so in the case of Islam, because Islam hasn't moved far enough away from warrior and tribal consciousness, because it's still sort of bound up with those structures, it hasn't emerged as a clear antithesis in the majority of its forms. Again, we can find, we're talking about this in general terms, right? So we can find postmodern forms of Islamic religion that are very advanced, and there's certainly aspects of Muslim society and culture, like we can see all kinds of modernism emerging in Turkey. So
that are very advanced, and also just to be clear, this is an issue. The relationship between warrior traditional and modernism is an issue for all religious traditions. So it's not just Islam.
Yeah. So I mean, again, I'm talking in general terms, and there's exceptions to everything I'm saying, and so there's levels of subtlety that go beyond this conversation. But for those who are listening, they'll have to allow us to sort of talk about it in these terms.
Yes.
So Islam, as a traditional culture, once was able to generate arguably the most advanced civilization on the planet. In the 800s, the 700s, and the 800s, they had incredible advances in mathematics and architecture, and it's certainly a worthy religion, and at one time definitely proved itself as evolutionarily powerful, but. What makes a traditional form of consciousness, or we could even say what makes a traditional form of religion successful or not, in my humble opinion, is how much truth it contains. And so the blind spots or that where it's deprived of truth makes it vulnerable. And so one of the ways that Islam is deprived of truth is that it can be so chauvinistic. All the forms of traditional consciousness are chauvinistic, okay? They all devalue women, and it's a problem with all of them. But Islam is undeniably the worst on this account. And because of it being so macho, when it was conquered by colonialism, when Europe basically, it's been conquered twice, once by the Mongols, right? And then again in the colonial time, and this left it sapped of its moral authority. Because it was macho, because it was so much about dignity. When that dignity was taken away militarily, much of the good of the structures collapsed. And so with it collapsing down, with its transcendent purpose, with its ability to move far enough away from warrior and tribal consciousness that can enact the dialectic and actually cause evolution and the progress of civilization. It needs to be purged. It needs to go through its own reformation. I know there's a lot of modern and postmodern Muslims who are calling for just such a thing, some kind of that we have to go through the same history that we see going through, that other civilizations going through that have become sustainably modernist and beyond, and that involves going through some kind of a reformation whereby some of the excesses that have accumulated in the religion are sort of purged, just like we saw the excesses of the Renaissance popes being purged with the emergence of Protestantism. And although it has its own problems, again, every new stage brings dignities and disasters. We can see where Islam needs to be strengthened so it can succeed at doing what traditional consciousness must do, and that is providing a sense of identity that goes beyond the tribe. And the fact that we see all this tribal strife, within Iraq is evidence that at least the Islamic civilization there is not able to move beyond the tribal barriers and cause a sense of brotherhood, among all those who are within the ethnocentric worldview.
Right.
Anyway, you always have to be careful about Islam because it's very subtle and very complex, and anything you say is could easily be contradicted by all kinds of examples. But I think these trends are well evident.
And the dynamics of those trends are certainly show up in most religions in some smaller forms, usually at the moment.
Right. I mean, just like the similarities in tribal cultures throughout the world are remarkable despite their diversity. I think we can see similar things with traditional, religions and traditional consciousnesses throughout the world, even though they all are unique and they all have diversity and we can identify, numerous differences. They're all trying to do the same thing in terms of their time in history. Mm-hmm. That is, the life conditions that are giving rise to that stage are a specific time in history, and so the solutions to those problems are again timeline specific. And so that's why all the traditional forms are so similar. Right. And of course, every one of these stages, because they're a system, they're like an organism. They have antibodies. They protect themselves. And so when the life conditions that animate a particular stage of consciousness become solved or diminish, the tendency is for that stage to project those life conditions, to invent them, to maintain its own kind of systemic metabolism. Mm-hmm. And that's why you see, for example, the fundamentalists in the United States projecting evils onto otherwise benign and innocent forms of culture, like, for example, homosexuality. Mm-hmm. They need a new form of evil to rail against. They haven't, most of the evil that they originally arose to take care of has been taken care of. So they got to find new evils to maintain their legitimacy. Right. And again, this spiral explains